If you're watching this, then volume Y wasn't enough. You've heard the warnings. You've seen the footage. You've felt that cold weight in your chest every time Dan Wheeler whispered into the trees. But Volume 2? This isn't just a mystery anymore. This is documentation, evidence, suppressed for decades. What you're about to see was never supposed to reach the public. Files marked DEEPROOTPROJECT. Footage taken under strict non-disclosure. And testimonies from rangers who were chained. No, trees are no longer the threat. They're the blueprint. And someone is building from it. Volume I told you what happened. Volume 2 will tell you what's coming. And you won't walk a trail again without thinking about what might be walking right behind you. Welcome back to MindFuel. Let's finish what Dan started. When land gives out beneath your feet, there's a sound it makes. A warning, a shift of gravel, the dry sigh of root systems snapping under strain. You expect collapse to be loud, sudden. But what Dan described wasn't collapse. It was more like the forest opened its mouth. The first pit showed up along Ridgeback Trail, wide as a truck, perfectly round, not caved in, not eroded, just absent. Dan said it hadn't been there the week before. He knew every bend of that trail, every fallen log. But this thing, he didn't find it. It found him. He said it didn't smell like soil, didn't even smell like earth. It was warm, humid, and deep enough that when he dropped a flare, it never hit bottom. Just vanished into the dark with a wet, muffled sound. Almost like it had been caught, like something had inhaled. Dan radioed it in. They marked it with cones. But 3 days later, when the crew came back to survey it, it was gone. Not just filled in. Gone. Replaced by level ground. Pine needles, moss, even footprints. Like it had never existed. Like it had closed behind itself. But that wasn't the worst part. That came on the 4th day. When he saw it happen with someone inside, there was a hiker, tourist, young guy from Idaho, came up solo, had a day pass. His name was Bryce. Dan saw him across the ravine, waving, smiling, walking along the perimeter where the first sinkhole had been. Then he stopped, looked down. The ground opened beneath him. No noise, no warning, just a circular yawn in the forest floor. And he dropped straight through. Dan shouted, ran, said he could see the edge folding behind the kid like a wound healing, like skin sealing. But it wasn't skin. Not exactly. He got within 30 feet and froze, because what he was looking at wasn't dirt. The pit hadn't swallowed Bryce. It had taken him. The walls of the sinkhole weren't earthen. They were tissue, veined, moist, dark red, moving, pulsing, like muscle under pressure. And down inside, just before the gap fully closed, he saw it. An eye. Not blinking. Not afraid. Just the earth reshaped. The moss reappeared. The hole was gone. And Bryce was never found. They logged it as an unmarked cave-in. But Dan knew. Because later that night, back in the tower, he found something on his boot. A smear. Brownish red. Sticky. Too dark for blood. Too thin for sap. He took a sample, sent it off. The lab emailed back one line. Sample contains dermal collagen. Origin undetermined. That's skin. That's human skin in the soil. And it wasn't from Bryce. The collagen was pre-aged, old, like it had been buried there for decades or longer, and still alive. 2 more pits opened that month. One near the radio tower, another behind the fire line station. Always the same pattern. Perfect circles, moist heat, gone within hours. Dan tried something. He set a game cam right at the center of one that hadn't yet closed. 24 hours of footage. When he played it back, the hole didn't collapse. It contracted, like a throat, squeezing inward, pulling itself shut, inch by inch. And at the final frame, just before the lens blacked out, a shape rose in the far distance. Tall, bent forward, watching the camera go dark, with arms that didn't bend right, and skin the same color as the pit walls. They weren't just holes. They weren't cave-ins. They were organs, openings, part of something bigger. Something not under the forest, but part of it, woven into it, alive, breathing, waiting. In the next chapter, we'll follow Dan to the coordinates found on the deep root file, a location not on any official map, an overgrown facility with reinforced walls and warnings burned into the concrete. Do not let it hear you think. Subscribe to MindFuel now, because if the forest has a body, then somewhere out there, it has a brain. There's a line most of us learn in grade school: leave no trace. Out here, we teach it like gospel, but there's something the brochures don't tell you. Sometimes the forest leaves a trace on you, and sometimes it decides whether you're supposed to be here at all. Dan had begun spending more time in the archive room. Stacks of old ranger journals, back when logs were handwritten and filed in carbon copies. He said it started as a way to clear his head, find patterns, maybe a little sanity. But the more he read, the less it felt like history, and more like prophecy. One journal in particular kept surfacing. A man named Ellis Grant, senior ranger, stationed in Red Pine during the early 60s. In 1963, he wrote, "Sector 3, trail loops wrong again. New growth overnight. Birdsong mimicked my voice this morning. No context, no elaboration, just observations, as if that was normal." Another entry, dated May 19th, 1963. "Animals watching again. Not afraid. Same 2 deer near my cabin, 3rd day in a row. Eyes seem too forward-facing, like they're thinking, like they want something." Dan flipped through years of these. Different handwriting, different people, but always the same notes, hidden in the margins like confessions. Compass reversed. Path bent backwards. Trees grew windows. Felt observed. And over again. This phrase is "Haxesiwa indastaking areriwors." Enevi idar dator must be staring datonemi, as if the forest was the one conducting the interview. He came across one log dated 1971. Ranger went missing that year, never found. But his last entry? "Smells like breath in the trees. Can't find trail markers. I think I'm being asked a question, but I don't know the answer." Dan told me later it made him nauseous, because he'd felt that same thing. Not fear, not danger exactly, but a presence, a pressure. Like something was watching through the bark and the branches, judging, weighing you, measuring your thoughts without asking permission. And then came the trees. Not new trees, old ones, big ones. The kind that don't just grow overnight, except they did. He woke up one morning to find a line of them, freshly rooted, closer to the station. They hadn't been there the day before. The earth around them was undisturbed. But their trunks, they leaned upward toward the ranger post. Branches angled like antennae. No wind, no animal sign, just silence, and a slight creak, like vertebrae adjusting, like something stretching awake. He backed up to get a better look, and realized the whole forest edge had shifted. Not gradually, not slowly, intentionally, as if every tree had inched forward during the night and stopped just short of the generator fence. He reported it. The department said it was impossible, said the root systems of trees that size would tear the earth apart if moved. That he must have misjudged. But Dan wasn't guessing. He had photos from 3 days ago, clear lines, marker flags, and now they were gone, smothered by bark and shadow. That's when Dan wrote his own words in the logbook. Big, all caps. We aren't the dominant species here. We're the intruders. It's never been our forest. And at the bottom, he circled one sentence twice. We're the invasive species now. What Dan saw next confirmed it. An old ranger, presumed dead, walking the tree line. Same face, same uniform, but he didn't blink, didn't speak, and the bark behind him moved. In the next chapter, we follow Dan as he tracks him into the zone where maps no longer work and time stops behaving normally. Subscribe to MindFuel now, because the forest doesn't want you here. It's trying to decide if it will let you leave. In the wilderness, time decays differently. Film warps, paper yellows, but magnetic tape, that can sleep for decades, and when it wakes up, it sometimes shows you things that were never meant to be seen again. Dan didn't find the tape by accident. He didn't even find it in Red Pine. It came by mail, unmarked envelope, no return address. Inside, a dust-caked VHS, labeled only in black marker, Red Pine experiment aborted. No date, no sender, but someone wanted him to watch it. So he borrowed an old VCR from the visitor center, popped the tape in, and pressed play. The footage was grainy. Colors bled at the edges. A timestamp flickered in the corner. August 14th, 1981. A single cameraman, breathing heavily, narrating in hushed whispers. His voice was calm, but wrong. Not scared. More like someone trying very hard not to sound scared. It begins in a clearing. Pine trees, fog. There's movement behind the trees, distant, slow. You hear bird song, but it loops unnaturally. The same 6-note pattern every 15 seconds. Identical pitch, identical timing, like a broken broadcast. Then the camera shifts, zooms in on a large tree, twisted, dead in the center. It's shaking, but there's no wind, just vibration, like something inside it trying to get out. And then it splits, not breaks, splits, right down the center, bark peeling like flesh, cracking open like a mouth. And from inside, something steps out. It's humanoid in shape, arms, legs, head. But its skin isn't skin, it's bark, veined with sap that glows faintly in the dark, moss growing across its shoulders, eyes like tree knots, hollow, but watching, fully formed, like it had been grown, not born. The figure doesn't walk, it tilts, moves in small, deliberate pivots as if its joints don't work the same way. It raises its hand, not a weapon, just acknowledgement. And behind it, in the open trunk, more movement. Other shapes, still forming, still twitching, as if the tree is a womb. The cameraman starts to panic now. His breathing becomes sharp. He backs away, too fast, snapping a branch underfoot, and the creature snaps toward him. The lens falls sideways. The image tumbles. We see the sky. We hear a noise, low, deep, wet. Then a rustle overhead, branches moving, but not from wind, from weight. The final shot is crooked, the camera pointing upward, as the ranger is lifted into the trees, feet dangling, arms slack. No scream, no words, just his body disappearing into the canopy as if being reclaimed. Then the screen cuts to black. For 5 full seconds, no sound. Then a final title card flickers across. Red Pine experiment, aborted, subjects no longer stable, do not re-engage. Dan watched the tape 3 times. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did. That thing in the tree. It wasn't new. It wasn't a mutation. It was part of something older. Something made. Something abandoned. And something that had been waiting to eat the tape to his supervisor. They denied the facility ever existed. Said no experiments were ever conducted in Red Pine. But Dan knew better, because the clearing in the video, he'd walked through it 2 days earlier, and the tree was still there. But it was closed, and bleeding. What was the Red Pine experiment? And why was it abandoned? In the next chapter, we uncover the secret memo trail leading to the Cold War, and a theory that red pine isn't a forest at all, but a containment system. Subscribe to MindFuel and don't miss what Dan finds next. Because the past didn't die in red pine. It took root, and now it's growing again. There's a phrase that comes up in forestry more than you'd think: operational silence. It's supposed to mean limited chatter during high-risk events. But in red pine, it started to mean something else, something colder, something more intentional. Dan had questions, and after the tape, he wanted answers, official ones. So he did what any veteran ranger would do. He filed a formal anomaly report, citing the coordinates of the old experiment site. He attached the footage, included comparison photos, topographical inconsistencies, unexplained trail looping, wildlife irregularities, all of it. He sent it to Region HQ, CC'd the Forest Service's Cartography Division, the Wildlife Bureau, and his supervisor. Standard protocol. But what he got back wasn't standard, not even close. The reply came 6 hours later. A single line. That region is not currently covered by satellite. Please refrain from future pings. No greeting, no signature, just a command. Dan replied again, asked for clarification. Red Pine had been under continuous scan coverage since 2006. Cloud-penetrating LiDAR, thermal readings. He'd seen the charts himself. He even had recent satellite overlay prints in his own office. He got no reply, at least not directly. But 2 days later, an internal memo came through. It wasn't addressed to Dan. It wasn't supposed to be seen by him. But someone hit double C, and his name was on it. Sound slows, hushes. It read, "Wheeler is still escalating. He's asking about Layer 3 coverage. Shut him down. He's too close to pattern completion." Dan read that line 5 times. Pattern completion. It didn't make sense. What pattern? What was he supposedly close to? He dug through the archived directories, years of planning documents, forest operations, fire service logs, and that's when he saw it. A new file designation for Sector 6. Effective immediately. Status: scheduled controlled burn. Personnel: none assigned. Fire team ETA: blank. Satellite tracking suspended. Dan drove out to Sector 6 the next morning. No smoke, no crews, no burn prep, just stillness and something worse: absence. There were no birds, no wind. The leaves weren't rustling. Even the air tasted different, dry, but not from heat. More like the silence that settles before something speaks. He parked near the Overlook Ridge, climbed to the crest, and from there he could see the entire basin. Sector 6 stretched out below like a wound that wouldn't close, and scattered along the forest floor, bare patches of ground in precise geometry, squares, circles, lines, each patch about the size of a ranger station. Nothing grew there, no moss, no insects, just raw, exposed dirt, perfectly flat. Dan took photos, marked coordinates. He was about to turn back when his radio crackled to life. 3 words, software garbled, but unmistakable. "You were seen." He froze. No call sign, wrong frequency, but it was his radio, and the voice, it sounded like his own. Just slower, like it had been recorded and replayed, with all the wrong muscles. Back at base, Dan tried to email what he'd found. The system rejected his access. Credentials locked. Firewall message: user expired. Station status: discontinued. As if his entire job, his entire existence had been erased. Like he was no longer part of the system. Like they'd decided he wasn't real. Dan isn't the first to be silenced, and he won't be the last. But what he uncovers next goes beyond patrol logs and burned clearings, a blueprint for something older than the Forest Service itself. subscribe to MindFuel, and don't miss the next chapter. Because the forest isn't under surveillance anymore. It's under quarantine. At first, Dan thought it was a miracle. Ranger Lucas had been gone for nearly 6 months. No signal, no GPS trail, no body. Declared lost. Presumed dead. And then one morning, there he was, standing outside the west cabin with his hands folded like he'd just stepped out for air. No injury, no wear, not even dirt on his boots. And yet, Dan knew something was wrong. Lucas didn't speak at first, just smiled, nodded, said he must have gotten turned around, claimed he'd survived off snowmelt and berries. But Dan had been here too long. He knew this forest. There were no berries in Sector 9 that time of year, no snowmelt either, just bare rock and a stillness that always felt watched. And Lucas, he never blinked. Dan started counting one day, just to be sure. 6 minutes. Not a single blink. Not even when the wind blew pine needles into his face. He also never ate. Staff dinners, camp cookouts. Lucas always filled a plate. But Dan never saw him take a bite. Not once. The food would just disappear. Thrown out. Or left where no one was watching. Like the idea of eating was more important than the act itself. And there was something else. His skin looked dry, but never peeled. His uniform, perfectly folded, always clean. Even his voice had changed. Syllables landing just a second too late, like he was rehearsing a memory that wasn't his. So Dan checked the cameras, night vision trail cams. He pulled the card from Cabin 3's motion detector, scrubbed through footage. Nothing, nothing. Then 2:41 a.m. A flicker. Lucas standing outside, staring into the woods. Then he turns toward the lens, walks closer, right up to it, and then his jaw. It splits, not open, sideways. A slow, unnatural stretch across his face like bark peeling away from a stump. You could hear the tendons crackle under the audio hiss. And his eyes, they rolled back like marbles sinking into dirt. Dan didn't sleep that night. And in the morning, he noticed 2 more rangers were different. Sarah from Trail Ops, Miller from Tower 5, both smiling more, both quiet, both never blinking. He ran a roll call. 28 rangers total, but his record said 33. The names didn't match. Some of the new ones had no personnel files at all. Dan confronted HQ. They said the staffing system had updated automatically, that new rangers were part of a temporary rotation, but he knew what that meant. They weren't hired. They weren't even human. They were replacements. It wasn't just that the forest was changing. It was learning. It wasn't just absorbing the lost. It was replicating them and putting them back into the cabins, into the trucks, into uniforms. One morning, Dan saw 2 rangers standing perfectly still in the middle of the trail, facing each other, not speaking, just waiting, like puppets without strings, until he passed, and they turned simultaneously, watching him leave. He knew then the forest no longer needed to hide, because the forest had figured out how to be us. They walk like us, they speak like us, but they are not us. And Dan's about to uncover the process that makes it possible, an ancient pattern of mimicry hidden beneath the roots. Subscribe to MindFuel. The truth isn't in the trees anymore. It's wearing a badge. Every ranger is taught to leave a final log if they ever feel like they won't be coming back. It's not procedure, it's culture. Unspoken, inherited, like the forest wants a record of its own mistakes or victories. Dan's last entry was time-stamped 4:17 a.m., dated 5 days after the camera footage of Lucas and 4 days after Dan stopped sleeping. The log begins like all the others: weather, trail status, wildlife counts. But then Dan pauses, and his voice, It drops to a whisper. He says, "The trees are moving again, but not in the wind. They're walking. I know that sounds impossible, but I've watched them. Every morning, they're in a slightly different position. They're angling inward. They're converging on something." Dan explains he's seen a clearing start forming where there never was one. Dead center of Sector 6, perfectly round, 1,200 feet across. No roots, no birds, no rot, just flat gray soil. And around the edge, the trees. Shifting closer, day by day, forming a perimeter. He'd placed markers in the dirt, rocks, flag tape, stakes. They were gone every morning, replaced by something else. Twigs woven into spirals. Dead moss, twisted into words he couldn't read. Once, a jawbone, still wet. In the log, Dan clears his throat. He says, "I don't think it's growing. I think it's building. Not like a structure, like a stage or a gate." The rest of the log is short. He packs a GoPro, full battery, headlamp, satellite beacon, although he doesn't expect it to work. And then he says, "If this footage makes it out, if someone's hearing this, run. Run from every forest. Because this one woke up. And the others won't be far behind." The next file we have is corrupted. A scrambled video header, then a flicker of frames, Dan's face, breathing heavy, branches parting around him, and behind him in the distance, the sound of trees, groaning, not creaking, not falling, groaning like lungs under bark. The last 5 seconds show Dan stepping into the clearing, but it's no longer empty. A single column stands at the center, vined, covered in moss, and glowing faintly from within. It pulses, once, like a heartbeat, and then the screen goes black. Dan walked into the woods one last time, and what he found may have been the forest's final form, or just its beginning. Subscribe to MindFuel. We'll be releasing a full breakdown of Dan's recovered footage, frame by frame, in our next chapter. What he saw wasn't natural, it was designed. There are files the public was never meant to see. Some of them flickered across Dan's corrupted footage. Others were recovered from a forgotten archive, burned, redacted, or half-digitized. But together, they formed a pattern, a name, a theory, and a warning. Project Root Mind. The earliest document is dated 1962. It's a memo, hand-typed, addressed to Division 5B, Non-Human Terrain Behavior. The title? Preliminary Notes on Below-Soil Mycelial Networking. It describes fungal colonies spread across 12,000 square miles, but what caught Dan's attention was the language. It wasn't ecological. It was cognitive. Phrases like memory transfer through rhizomatic relay, decision nodes adapting to human stimuli, personality clustering through biotic feedback. This wasn't about mushrooms. It was about intelligence, something learning underground, something using roots like wires, sinking deep, far beyond what any ranger had ever drilled. And worse, it was listening. In one scanned photo, Dan found a chart labeled Terraforming Sequence, Stage 2, Cognitive Absorption Phase. Complete. The image below was horrifying. Ranger profiles, dozens of them, all marked with red slashes. Names he knew, names he'd worked beside, some marked replicated, others marked dissolved. And then at the bottom, Dan Wheeler, still uncrossed. But someone had written beside it in pencil, active node, being watched. Dan had always thought he was watching the forest, but now he understood. It had been studying him. He found intake forms that weren't just for job applications. They had biometric signatures, neural response logs, even written pattern assessments. How do you react to death? What do you do when lost? What sound unsettles you the most? These weren't questions for employment. They were tests, filters. Dan dug further, pulling from old ranger logs, private communications, even intercepted emails. He built a theory, scrawled in the margins of his last field journal. The forest isn't evolving randomly. It's becoming singular. It wants form, it wants thought, and it wants us to finish it. It wasn't just absorbing the bodies, it was mapping their decisions, building a composite self, one informed by ranger knowledge, patrol routes, intuition, trust, a forest brain, the root mind. In one final recovered tape, a voice, heavily distorted, says, "The trees remember. The ground speaks. Every footprint is recorded. Every hesitation, copied." And then it ends with a phrase whispered on loop. One forest, one mind, one memory. You thought the woods were wild, unmapped, natural. But what if they were designed? A thinking organism pulling in every stray ranger to become more complete? Subscribe to MindFuel. Because this is only stage 2, and stage 3 may already be under your feet. Red Pine National Forest was permanently closed on August 14th, 2024. No press release, no interviews, just a notice. Due to structural instability from wildfire damage, all access to the region is now prohibited. Violators will be prosecuted. But no smoke was ever seen, no satellite recorded flames, no fire team was dispatched, just silence and fencing. Miles of it, strung up fast, overnight, like they'd been planning it all along. The ranger station is gone, leveled, as if it never existed. All trails erased, parking lots overgrown with moss. Even the road in vanished beneath soil, like the forest had simply rolled over it in its sleep. Still, some hikers claim they've found their way in. The brave, or the reckless. Urban explorers. Paranormal forums are full of stories now. Grainy footage, shaky phone cams. The most talked about clip? A still frame, low-res, heavily pixelated, of what looks like a man, tall, bark-skinned, waving from behind a cedar tree. But when the frame brightens, you see its hand has 5 branches instead of fingers, and no eyes, just knots where eyes should be, no mouth, just bark that splits when the wind blows the right way, and behind it, dozens more, all waving. Locals in nearby towns started whispering, "The woods are walking." Children told stories of voices in the grass, phones ringing from unknown numbers, static and the sound of wind in leaves. But then, even the stories stopped. Red Pine dropped off GPS, search engines rerouted queries, and Dan Wheeler's name erased from official rosters, scrubbed, like he was never there at all. We found one final message, left in the back end of the ranger station's archived drive, deeply hidden. It was only 4 words, typed in a blank document. It doesn't need us. And maybe that's the truth. Maybe what was once wild has become something else. Not a place to protect, not a system to preserve, but a living thing, a finished thing. The forest doesn't need guardians anymore. It became its own. Red Pine isn't on the map anymore. But maybe places like it are waking up all over the world. What if the next forest you hike through isn't just watching, but remembering you? Subscribe to MindFuel for future chapters, and the full breakdown of recovered data files, unexplained disappearances, and ranger reports across other national parks. Because if what happened in Red Pine was just the beginning, then the forest is already ahead of us, and it might be waiting.